Hey everyone, my name is Wedge. I'm sure you saw the title of this video, Budget Vintage. Those are two words that do not go together and completely contradict each other, like an oxymoron. For instance, Microsoft Works, oxymoron. It's a pretty good one in fact. Or something more simple like Living Dead, you see what I mean? Anyways, today is a special deck tech, one I've been working with all week in preparation for this video. I'm about to show you a tuned vintage deck that will not cost as much as a new car. I know, craziness. To make sure I stay true to my word, we're going to use TCG player pricing throughout the video so you can see what we're working with. So without further ado, let's talk budget vintage. Really excited. Now remember, before we get into the nitty-gritty, vintage is an expensive format. By expensive, I mean the average cost of a deck is over $15,000. Kind of happens when you can play the Power 9. Let's take a look at the prices of some of these cards. Black Lotus, Mox Sapphire, Mox Jet, and Mox Ruby are all in around 90% of all vintage decks. Look at the prices of just these cards. So when we're talking about budget vintage decks, we're not talking about a $50 deck. We can't do that when the average cost of a good vintage deck is above $15,000. Our target? Under $1,000. You may think that's expensive, but compared to other top-tier vintage strategies, it's less than 10% of the total cost. The best part about this strategy, it's competitive. Variations on this list I'm presenting to you have already won events in top-aided competitive vintage tournaments. I've waited long enough to do this. Let's talk vintage Eldrazi aggro. We'll begin with our land base. There are no basic lands in the deck. We're going right to the non-basics. We have playsets of Cavern of Souls, Ancient Tomb, Eldrazi Temple, and Wasteland. In addition to being solid colorless sources we absolutely need, each of these lands provides a unique function. Cavern of Souls is the glue that holds everything together. Without the ability to cast uncounterable Eldrazi spells, we're playing a little bit too fairly. Cavern of Souls guarantees our answers get onto the battlefield and beat face quickly. Ancient Tomb is a broken card that we just couldn't cut. The 2 damage you're taking is mostly irrelevant because that 2 colorless mana is letting you cheat your entire deck out early. Same thing with Eldrazi Temple. We're playing colorless Eldrazi. Eldrazi Temple helps us cheat them in just like in Modern and in Legacy. Wasteland is our last land playset because it's Wasteland. Colorless mana source and it destroys opposing lands we really don't want to deal with. We're talking about a format that is defined by non-basic lands. This format has Tolarian Academy in it, for goodness sakes. Where were we? Right, the rest of the land base. After our playsets, we have 3 Eye of Ugin for more Eldrazi ridiculousness, 3 Ghost Quarter for more land destruction and more colorless mana production, 2 Urborg Tomb of Yawgmoth because we do have some optional black mana we want to use sometimes, and 1 Strip Mine because it's a broken land and more land destruction is good. Easily the most expensive part of the deck, the land base for Eldrazi Vintage is actually really important. In addition to you needing to guarantee you have enough colorless sources, each of your lands has to provide some additional value. Compared to a lot of decks in this format, we're playing pretty fair. We need advantages where we can get them. 25 lands in total, very consistent mana base, won't steer you wrong. Moving on to our creatures, we're running a bevy of Eldrazi I'm sure you're already familiar with. That's actually one of the best aspects of this deck. Unlike a lot of vintage strategies, this is great for newer vintage players. It's full of cards you already know. Anyways, we'll begin with the bottom of our curve. We're running 4 Endless 1 and 4 Eldrazi Mimic to start. Both staples in the strategy. We're talking about 2 cards that benefit greatly from our cheating lands like Ancient Tomb, Eldrazi Temple, and Eye of Ugin. What most people don't realize is that Vintage isn't a turn 1 format. The game isn't going to end if you don't go infinite turn 1. There's way more time than you think. Dropping an Eldrazi Mimic turn 1 and then a 4/4 Endless 1 turn 2 is a strong play. Again, this isn't a turn 2 format. Moving to the 3-drop slot, we have 3 Matter Reshaper. One of the least flashy cards in the deck, the Reshaper provides nice board pressure when it's alive, good value when it dies, and synergizes with all your cheaty lands. It may seem like a filler card, and it sort of is, but I've gotten ahead a lot more than you might think off of a Matter Reshaper dying and replacing itself. Moving up to 4 drops, we'll start with one of the strongest cards in the deck, Thought-Knot Seer. We're running 4 of them. Being able to play a Thought-Knot Seer on turn 2 is devastating for your opponent. It's one of the reasons this deck can be as good as it is. In this format, answers are more important than any other format. The ability to take apart your opponent's answers, or even the questions they're trying to ask you, is huge. Each card in Vintage is so powerful, Thought-Knot Seer has crazy value here. It's so good it's played in non-Eldrazi decks in the format, just let that sink in. It's an amazing card, you always want to draw it. Up the curve we go. Next is a Playset of Reality Smasher in the 5 mana slot. Easily one of your best beaters, the Smasher requires so much from your opponent that removing it is never easy. You can get it onto the battlefield really quickly, and it has immediate impact thanks to haste. Trample is just icing on the disgusting cake that is this card. There are plenty of strategies in Vintage that don't want to 2-for-1 themselves, as in most decks ever. Reality Smasher is one of those cards that forces an answer immediately. Have an Eldrazi Mimic on the field when this comes down? Good luck surviving that. The last creature in the deck is Endbringer. We're running 3 of them. Now, this is a card that I was really hesitant to play because I was positive that a 6-mana Dirtly Eldrazi had no place in the format, but every deck builder before me who ran it, they were totally right. Endbringer is insanity. While the Eldrazi does bring a lot of abilities to the table, its real value is in its power and toughness. Believe it or not, you'll be attacking with this more often than not. Of course, being able to take down an unflipped Delver or Young Pyromancer at a moment's notice is delicious, and drawing a card is the bee's knees. You're going to be the aggressor a lot of the time. Endbringer is 6 mana, but in your deck, it's more like 3 to 4 mana. No reason not to play it. That's going to do it for our creatures, 22 in total. This is a bit less than the average Eldrazi aggro deck in Vintage, but that's because we actually chose to cut Phyrexian Metamorph in favor of a different kind of aggression. If you want to play the Metamorph as a budget option for the next card we talk about, you totally can. The Metamorph clones all your Eldrazi, it can clone reanimated targets from your opponent. Card is great, but for the deck we're playing, I had much better results with what we're about to talk about next. We're running 2 Crucible of Worlds, probably the most unfair thing we're doing. Crucible of Worlds is absolutely necessary based on our land decisions. We're running Ghost Quarter, Wasteland, and Strip Mine. We have 8 destructive lands. Part of the reason the deck is so powerful is the land destruction package. Crucible of Worlds is us going deep on that. Most of Vintage's best lands are obviously non-basics. Some decks rely on them to win. Tolarian Academy, Bazaar of Baghdad, the list goes on. Crucible of Worlds lets us bridge the gap between the unfair decks and ours. It takes away a bit from the pure aggression, but it adds so much more value the trade-off is worth it. In testing, this version of the deck performed way better than the version with the Metamorph. The card is expensive, yes, but if you want the most competitive version of this specific strategy, Crucible is amazing. In addition to the Crucible, we're running 4 Null Rod main deck. For those of you following the various iterations of this strategy, this should not surprise you. So much of Vintage is artifact-based, even if you take the Moxen and Black Lotus alone. Those are activated abilities. Null Rod forces them to play somewhat fair, and with cards like Ancient Tomb, you can get this online right away. Best part about Null Rod, because you're not running any crazy artifact goodness, it doesn't hit you at all, making it even better. We're also running a single Chalice of the Void. This is another card designed to make our opponents play at our pace. Drop it on 1, you turn off some of the most played cards in the format. Drop it on 0, you just bridged the $15,000 gap between you and your opponent. Just like Null Rod, this card is designed to make your opponent play the way you want to play. But we don't want too many. Between this, the Null Rods, and the Crucibles, we're good. The rest of the deck is made up of 6 instants, 3 Dismember, and 3 Warping Wail. Dismember is a pretty easy include. You don't much care about taking damage, but you do have Urborgs to lessen that damage if you need to. -5/-5 is going to kill most anything in the format, so I wouldn't worry about it being big enough. Also, it's important to note that creatures like Haldath the Forgemaster, opposing Thought-Knot Seers, Triskelions, there are enough creatures in Vintage that need something like Dismember over a card like Spatial Contortion, so that's how that choice was made, just for the record. Warping Wail is one of the hidden all-stars in the deck, and I really had to resist playing 4. There was simply no room. You'd be surprised how many creatures in Vintage have power or toughness 1 or less. Phyrexian Revoker, Delver of Secrets, Unflipped, Young Pyromancer, Thalia, Jace Unflipped, Baleful Strix. Also, and this is nothing to ignore, it counters sorceries, so Treasure Cruise, Tinker, Time Walk, so many fun things to hate on. Warping Whale has this weird place in Vintage. I gotta tell you, it's basically amazing in every way, easily one of the best cards in the deck. Now that we're done with the deck, let's review what we're trying to do, then I'll talk budget options with you. The goal is to use our cheat lands like Ancient Tomb, Eldrazi Temple, and Eye of Ugin to get our Eldrazi out early. If you can play Endless Ones and Eldrazi Mimics on turn 1, you absolutely should every time. Drop Thought-Knot Seer and Reality Smashers as soon as humanly possible, then beat face like there's no tomorrow. Crucible of Worlds will bring back your land destruction, which you will be using generously. Seriously, destroy everything. Keep them low on lands. It's the best way to get ahead in a game for you. Lastly, use your Warping Whales and Dismembers to keep the board clear and keep your opponent from doing stupid, unfair things. It's an aggressive deck with a powerful disruption package. For the record, this deck is already absurdly budget for Vintage, but I'll try to do you one better. You can put the Phyrexian Metamorphs back in and take out Crucible of Worlds. It's going to save you almost $150 right there. Also, I like Aether Hub and Crystal Vein as land replacements if you don't have Cavern of Souls or Ancient Tomb, but again, I have to be clear about this. This deck is only top tier competitive with the original list I gave you. If you take out these cards for their budget alternatives, you will still have a mostly competitive deck, but it will not be optimal. Just keep that in mind going forward. Talking sideboard really quickly, your staples are Leyline of the Void, Grafdigger's Cage, another Warping Whale, and Leyline of Sanctity. You're going to see a relatively straightforward sideboard for most of these variants because of the budget nature of the deck, plus you don't want to dilute your plan too much. Like the deck itself, there isn't going to be much movement in this variation. Maybe 5 to 6 cards total, but it's pretty well optimized, main deck and sideboard both. That's going to do it for our Vintage budget Eldrazi aggro deck. What'd you think? Now, there are other Eldrazi variations in Vintage that I could talk about, but they're miserable on this budget, so we'll talk about them another time. As far as this variation goes, do you like it? Is this something you'd consider getting into Vintage with? I gotta say, building a competitive Vintage deck for under $1,000 is a bit ridiculous. I know it's a lot of money, but Vintage is Vintage. It's stupidly expensive, so I think something has been accomplished here. Remember, if you want to see the deck list or buy any of the cards in the deck, you can click the first link in the description. Everything you need is right there. If you ever wanted to get into Vintage with a top tier deck on a budget, this is how you do it. As always, be sure to subscribe for the latest and most reliable Magic the Gathering information you could ever need. This is the Mana Source, I'm Wedge, thanks for watching, we'll see you next time.